Welcome back. In the next few videos, we're going to discuss JavaScript loops. So we have a few different objectives. The first one is to understand why we use loops and what they are. The next one is to understand what dry, it's an acronym, DRY, what that stands for and how to write dry code. And then lastly, we'll be writing some simple while loops to start. So here's a problem I'll pose. If I wanted to print the numbers from 1 to 10, each one on a different line, with what we know so far, I would have to have 10 different console.logs. And that's already not ideal, but what if I wanted to do every number between 1 and 10,000, or the first million numbers? Suddenly I'm having to write a lot of code myself. So this is where loops come in. So even though we most likely wouldn't print the numbers from 1 to 10,000 in a real production application, let's take an example like Facebook, where a single photo or post can have 10,000 different comments on it, like those photos that go viral that get thousands and thousands of comments. Behind the scenes, there's some sort of loop that's being used to print out all the comments on the page, rather than for every comment, there needing to be a separate line of code. So before we see the syntax of while loops in JavaScript, I want to introduce this concept called dry code. So dry stands for don't repeat yourself. It's a concept that's thrown around a lot in all sorts of programming languages. What it comes down to is that we don't want to repeat our code. So if we take a look at this example here, this code is very, very repetitive. The only difference is the number that we're printing out, but otherwise every line is the same. So this code is not what we would consider dry. Some people would call this wet, which I've heard wet code stands for write everything twice. That's not as common to hear though as dry. So what loops do is they allow us to dry up our code. They are one of the tools at our disposal. Some of the others that we'll learn about later are functions and arrays and objects, but loops are the most fundamental one. So we're going to start by talking about while loops. There are multiple types of loops that we'll see. The first one is the while loop, and the while loop is very similar to an if statement. So it takes a condition like x less than 5 or answer not equal to end, and then while that condition is true, it will repeat code that we put inside of curly braces. So an if statement is very similar, except it doesn't repeat the code, it just runs it one time. A while loop will continue to run the code as long as the condition is true. So here's an example. This is how we could print the numbers from 1 to 5 using a while loop. So we start with a variable called count. It could be named anything, but count, we started at 1. Then we have our while loop with a condition that says count less than 6. So the very first time this code runs, count is equal to 1. So 1 is less than 6, so this is true. So here's an example of using a while loop to print the numbers from 1 to 5. So we start by initializing a variable called count, could be named anything, and we start it as 1. Then we have our while loop, and the syntax again is while and then a condition. In this case, the condition is count less than 6. So the first time that this loop runs, count is 1, so 1 less than 6 is true, so then this code is run. So that's going to print out count is 1, and then it will add 1 to count. And then it goes again, and it checks. Is count, which is 2 less than 6? That's true, so it prints again, and it adds 1 to count. Now it's 3. This is true again, so it prints count is 3, adds 1 to count, which is 4, and so on, until the final time count is 5. 5 is less than 6. We print out count is 5. We add 1 to count, which is now 6. And then it tries to run again, and it realizes 6 is not less than 6. So then it's done, and that's it. So I'll go ahead and open up my console and run this code. Just paste it in here. Count starts at 1. It runs while count is less than 6. I hit enter, and I get count is 1 all the way down until the last time of the loop, count is 5. So I could also try changing this a bit. If I wanted to print the numbers between 5 and 20, if I wanted 20 to be included, I would need to change this to either be less than or equal to 20 or less than 21. So I'll do less than or equal to, and that will actually include 20. As you can see, 5 down to 20. Similarly, I can also do things where I'm not just adding 1 every time. So if I want to count by 2s, I would just write count plus equals 2 rather than just adding 1. So this time it will start at 5, then it will go through, the condition is true, it prints out the count, then it adds 2, so now we're at 7. And then it adds 2 next time, and so on, and we end up with this. 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 19. So as you can probably see already, a loop can help us save a lot of time. Rather than having to have 10 different console.log statements or 15 console.log statements, we just wrote it one time in a loop, and that takes care of the rest for us. So I have another example here, where instead of just printing numbers, we're using a while loop to loop through a string and print out every character separately. So the output looks like this, HELLO on separate lines. So that's 5 console.log statements. And the way that we achieve that, we start with our string equal to hello. It's called str. Then we have our count, which will be the number that we use to access a character in the string. It's the index. And remember, the first character is always at index 0. So then what we're going to do is say while count is less than the length of the string. So the length is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So while the count is less than 5, we're going to print out the string with a character at index of count. So what that means, I'll open up my console and step through this. We start, just add this over here, string is equal to hello, var count is 0. So rather than just copying the while loop over, I'm going to start by just showing you how it works. So while count is less than the string.length, and string.length is 5, so 0 is less than 5, that is true. We're going to console.log string bracket count. So that's going to be string of 0, which gives us h. And then we add 1 to count. So count plus plus. So now count is 1. So we repeat this again. Is count less than string.length? Is 1 less than 5? Yes. So now we do this line again, console.log string of count. And count is now 1, so we get E. So this keeps going until the very last time where we print out O, and we add 1 to count, which then is equal to 5. And 5 is not less than 5, so the loop is over. Remember that the length is always 1 greater than the highest index of a string. So the length is 5 characters, but the maximum index is 4 because we start at 0, 1, 2, 3, O is at index 4. So that's how you could use a loop to print out every character in a string. So one last note about while loops is that we can create something called an infinite loop if we're not careful. So an infinite loop occurs when the condition that we provide is never false. So it just keeps going and going and going and going forever. And these are obviously problematic. They can crash your browser, they take up all the memory in JavaScript. It's not something that you ever want to do. So here's an example of how one would happen. We have count equal to 0, and then we're saying while count is less than 10, console.log count. Well, count is always less than 10 because it's 0, and we're never changing count. So it's never incremented, it's never going to be over 10, so this will just print 0 forever. So I don't recommend you do this, but you could copy this and paste it into your console, and what you would see, it would print a ton of zeros to start, and rather than running infinitely, most browsers nowadays would actually stop it and alert you that there's some bad code written, there's some infinite loop that's running. So just to contrast that with a loop like this, we have to increment count. We have to make this condition at some point be false. If we don't, it will just keep running forever, like this one does here.